Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to break down one of the most important and maybe one of the most complicated global agreements of our time, the Paris Agreement on Climate Change. So let's just start with a huge question. Seriously, think about this. How do you get nearly 200 different countries, all with their own politics, their own economies, their own priorities, to agree on a single rulebook for a problem as massive as climate change? Well, the way they did it was actually pretty clever. The whole entire complex agreement is anchored around one simple idea. It all starts with a single number.
And that brings us to the absolute core of the agreement. This whole thing is basically about setting a speed limit for how fast our planet is allowed to warm up.
So the main goal, right? The big headline number that everybody talks about is to keep the global average temperature from rising more than 2 degrees Celsius. That's widely seen as the tipping point we have to stay under to avoid the absolute worst impacts of climate change.
But here's where you really see the ambition of this thing. The agreement doesn't just stop at 2 degrees. It actually pushes countries to try even harder, to pursue efforts to limit the warming to an even safer 1.5 degrees.
Now you're probably thinking, okay, 1.5 or 2 degrees warmer, then what? That's a great question. And the answer is, it's measured against pre-industrial levels. Basically, we're comparing today's temperatures to what they were right before the Industrial Revolution really kicked off and we started burning fossil fuels on a massive scale.
Okay, so the world has its target. We know the number. But how you actually get everyone on board to hit it? Well, this is where the Paris Agreement tried something totally new.
So the climate agreement before this, the Kyoto Protocol, it was what you'd call top-down. It basically set mandatory targets for the rich, developed nations. And, well, that didn't work out so great. A lot of countries just weren't on board. So the Paris Agreement completely flips the script. It uses a bottom-up approach. Instead of a few countries being told what to do, every single country gets to set its own goals.
And these individual plans that each country comes up with, they have a formal name. They're called Nationally Determined Contributions, or NDCs for short. You can pretty much think of an NDC as each country's personalized homework assignment for fighting climate change.
And here's the really brilliant part. There's an ambition booster built right into the system. A country can't just set a goal and then call it a day. The rules say that every new NDC you submit has to be a step up. It has to be more ambitious than your last one. There's literally no going backwards.
But, cutting emissions is just one part of this giant puzzle. The agreement is designed to be way more than just a plan to lower pollution. It's a whole framework for climate action.
So yeah, it covers mitigation, which is the fancy word for reducing emissions. But it also talks about adaptation, how we adjust to the climate change that's already happening. It addresses loss and damage, which is a huge deal. And it sets up systems for finance, for sharing technology, and for making sure everyone's being open and honest about their progress.
Okay, let's zoom in on that loss and damage point for a second, because it was a major point of negotiation. The agreement officially recognizes that some countries are suffering irreversible losses from climate change. But, and this is a huge but, to get everyone to sign on, it specifically says this acknowledgement doesn't create any legal liability or a basis for compensation. It's a really fine line, but it was absolutely critical to getting the deal done.
And what about the money? Finance is a massive part of this. Developed countries made a huge pledge, a goal to provide $100 billion a year to developing countries by 2020 to help them shift to green energy and adapt to a hotter planet.
So, with almost 200 different plans all happening at once, you might be wondering, how does the world keep track of it all? How do we know if we're actually making progress? Well, the agreement has a really clever checkup system built right in.
The whole process has a kind of rhythm to it. It was adopted way back in 2015, it officially kicked off in 2016, and just recently, in 2023, we had the very first big progress report, something called the Global Stocktake. So this Global Stocktake is basically the world's 5-year report card on climate change. It's the moment when we add up all those individual country pledges, all those NDCs, and we ask one simple, gigantic question. Is it enough? Are we, as a planet, actually on track to meet our goals?
Now, all this talk about NDCs can feel a bit abstract, so let's make it real. Let's take a look at what this actually looks like for a major country. Here's how India translated the Paris Agreement into its own action plan.
So for its first NDC, India put 3 big measurable goals on the table. First, they pledged to make their economy way more carbon efficient. Second, a huge push to get 40% of their electricity from clean, non-fossil fuel sources. And third, to grow their forests so they could act like a giant sponge, soaking up billions of tons of CO2 from the atmosphere.
And all of this brings us to the fundamental question at the heart of the agreement. It's really the big challenge. How do you actually enforce any of this?
And here's the central paradox of the Paris Agreement. The treaty itself, it's legally binding. But the committee that oversees whether countries are following through, its role is explicitly non-punitive. Their job is to help and encourage, not to punish. There are no fines, no sanctions if a country misses its own self-declared target. Which leaves us with the one massive question that hangs over the entire Paris Agreement. Can a system that is built on national promises, on peer pressure, and ultimately on trust, a system with no real enforcement teeth, can that actually be enough to solve a global crisis of this scale? That's the test, and it's happening right now.